So what I wanted to do today is I know I promised we would look back on Sunday, and we will do that, but I'd also like to look a little bit forward because Holy Week is what, 2 weeks away? A little over 2 weeks away, beginning on Palm Sunday, and I'd like to look a little bit at what do we do with Holy Week when our faith traditions tend to play that in a way that we no longer, um, well, I'll speak for myself. I no longer feel comfortable with. So, but before we do that, let's look back on Sunday. Anything? I hope you heard yourselves in the sermon on Sunday, because it was very much um, um, coming out of our conversation on Tuesday. So thank you for that. Um, Anybody want to comment on Sunday? And I had a few technical uh, bits of feedback. People were asking for a worship bulletin, which of course we didn't do for this, and so we'll add that to next Sunday. But and a few other requests about um, including more of our worship service in there. So we'll have to negotiate that with the folks who are actually worshiping in person. But
I heard a lot about metanoia.
aha, it's
So
it's
now
a
I know that word.
well, it's one of my favorite words in Greek. It has a multiplicity of meaning, but the basic repent thing is a very limited translation of what it actually means. So yeah, change the way you think about things, change the way you do things. You'd never heard that before.
I have, but it sounded so musical. It sounded
Ah,
like it
okay.
was the heart of the thing. Metanoia is very important, and it made me think. And how do I use it? Uh, it's a foreign Greek word, I guess. So I usually never use it in my conversation. When I was in school and I went after my Sunday service, uh, and I had non-Christian friends in school because it was a multicultural school. And I used the word countenance because the pastor had spoken about transfiguration, and everybody looked at me like, what is that word? Why did you say it? My friends kept asking. So I love words,
Mm-hmm.
and they bring a different meaning to my understanding of the Bible and how it works. And it sticks in my mind.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about the particularly the languages of that the Bible was written in, Hebrew and Greek, is for centuries in Europe, women were not allowed, they were not permitted to study Hebrew or Greek. And it was in the mid 1800s when a few women began to study Hebrew and Greek in secret. And there wasn't a lexicon that had any kind of scholarly contributions from women until uh, mid last century.
Mm.
And so the way in which the research was done to find out how the canonical Greek only has about 3,500 words in it. So it's not all of the canonical Greek language. And Aramaic was lost to us. We didn't have any understanding of what Aramaic meant until we recovered some of that in around, I think it was around 1968 or 78. I can't remember when. Either 68 or 78, when we uncovered some they had been uncovered before the Second World War, but they didn't come into the public academies until late in the last century. And so then we began to have the words for the Aramaic, which is what Jesus would have spoken. And so the combination of having Aramaic and a different perspective on the scholarship of the language, we have expanded the meaning of what we're reading in scripture in ways that simply were not possible before the last century. So it's quite amazing. I did notice Steve's hand up there before I went on that tangent. Steve?
No, I like the sermon. It scratched the surface of a big area that church normally avoids, and and so that's and it's related to how we look at ourselves and how we look at our institutions, and how church has kind of been focused in on making sure you're good, okay, you're right with God, but we're all part of these institutions I call principalities and powers and whatever, that we don't really think about too much, and that's really where I think the revolutionary piece of Jesus really comes into play, that the church since, of course, um, the fourth century has kind of ignored. But hooray for you! It's something that, I mean, we might consider delving into a little bit more because it is so foreign to most people.
Yeah. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to do a little bit of looking forward today. One of the things that I want to talk about in terms of how we walk our way through Holy Week is uh, the reality that what we've been doing with the story of Jesus is so limited. Um, my working theme, and those of you who are on the worship team haven't even heard this yet, but my working theme for Holy Week this year is Jesus is the penultimate parable of resistance. And so looking at uh, Jesus not as a figure to be believed in or worshipped, but in much the way that John Dominic Crossan approaches it, which is that Jesus is a character in a parable. And in that parable, we see what resistance looks like. And the reason I'm choosing the modifier as penultimate is I think that the whole purpose of the parable of Jesus is that we become resistance. That we look to this parable. Parables are designed to transform the way in which we live, and so we look to the parable of Jesus as the penultimate parable of resistance, and what we can learn about resisting what you called the powers and principalities from this particular parable, which I think is crucial. And some of you may have the West Star Institute published a book recently, Between Jesus and Christianity. I can't remember what the exact title of it is. But in that book, you will find also a kind of continuation of what the Jesus Seminar was doing, looking at the first 4 centuries of Christianities, and seeing what they can learn about and comment upon the kind of imperial Christianity that we live in today. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of looking ahead to Holy Week. So this was kind of a teaser to get us partway there. There'll be some more coming. We have a parable this Sunday. Actually, a parable for the next 2 Sundays. We have the parable of the I never know of the sons.
Prodigal son.
Well, I like to call it the sons, because I think there's a lot to be said for the elder son as well.
Yes.
I also I don't want to give too much of where I'm going this away, because I may not even get there. Is the reality that that story has so many layers to it, that parable has so many layers to it, that we get preoccupied by the son that runs away, and we don't actually talk about the son who stays behind. Where's the mother in that story? And is the father that stupid that he responds to his children that way? I mean, there's Doug is shaking his head. I can see him shaking his head. Anyway, there's
He's
all
loving. He's loving.
he is loving, and that's one. I agree with you. He's totally loving, but he's also been totally shattered by his 2 children. Basically, I mean, he's if if your children come to you and say, "Give me my inheritance now," um, and then they divvy up what's actually yours, and go on and do their own thing, um, that poor father, right? Is he loving or is he enabling? Interesting question. The problem is that many of us have in our minds been trained to think of the father in the story as God. What if the father in the story isn't God? What if the father in the story is me? And the people who are coming and saying, "Give me my inheritance now," are the poor and the oppressed.
Mm.
I mean, there's a different way of looking at it. And that's the beauty of parables, right? You can there isn't a correct interpretation. If we really believe this stuff is living word, then it's like any piece of great literature. It is alive with a multiplicity of meaning. And the meaning requires the reader or the listener to create. It's not about the original meaning. There never is an original meaning. Ask anybody who writes anything and distributes it publicly. It doesn't matter what you intend to say. It's what people hear that becomes the meaning. It's interesting how we have these fixed notions of who the characters are, but if we move ourselves around as different characters in that parable, as the parent in that parable, what's being asked of you? That's huge, right? Give me all your money now and trust me to take care of you. I mean, how does that work? And how does that challenge our imperialistic notions of the poor? I remember someone once screaming at me because I gave out tokens. We used to give out food. What do they call those cards? Gift cards, and they could be spent in various different places. But someone was annoyed with me and yelled at me quite profusely because that token could be taken and the person could buy cigarettes with it, right? So they wanted to control this person in poverty. They wanted power over this person in poverty. And I almost felt like saying, well, they can also go buy a bottle of wine, but your particular bugaboo is cigarettes. Like, what is the difference? Like, this is a gift. It's not a gift if I give it and say you can only spend it on this, right? It's interesting how we have this view of those who are less fortunate than us is still so paternalistic. Like, we know better than you what you need to do with your life. I mean, I didn't smoke for very long, but stress is something that used to make me want to, go outside with the smokers. And I remember when we were having battles in the church, all the smokers would go outside and smoke. And I thought, what a great relief, to just be able to go out and do something like that. Well, I'm not arguing that smoking is a good thing, but we think we know better what people need to do with their resources. It's interesting how that plays itself out. And if we are the prodigal, which we all like to think of ourselves as, right? We're the prodigal. We go off and we no, Doug doesn't ever want, who are you in the story, Doug?
I'm nobody.
Oh,
I
okay.
can see the feelings of all three.
Oh,
Yeah.
there's more than three people in the story, though.
Well, okay, the three most prominent ones.
Yeah. The thing with any story, though, Doug, is you're always in it. I mean, think of it scientifically. I should never do this with Doug because he knows he'll just take my science and mash it all up because I'm not a scientist, but a particle observed is changed, right? When you read the story, you're changing the story.
Mhm.
No, you're not changing the story. The story is still there, but different people at different points in time, different readers interpret it differently and
But
get
but
different
this,
things out of it. But that's not changing the story. The story's written down. Unless someone tells the story and tells it in a different way, then it's changed.
well, when you read it, all reading is interpretation, and so that's
Right.
a retelling of the story. So
Mhm.
Whatever.
yeah. But I mean, I think one of the things we have to recognize is that for a period of time when we were doing the New Testament historical criticism, we presumed that we could get to the original meaning of the story, that we could understand what the story meant in the first century. That's an illusion. We'll never know what the original author was doing. And if we believe it's living word, which I think all great art is living, it exists, it has an existence. The same with a great movie. You can watch it in a 1970s version of what's a movie that's been remade recently? West Side Story. I never liked it, but never liked the 1960s version. I'm not much on the new version either. But they're completely different interpretations of the story. Same piece of writing, but it has life and it has new life now. A different cast gives it new life. A painting, beautiful painting, can be created to communicate a particular thing in a particular time, which 100 years later, it's communicating something completely different because people see different things in it. Renee and then Shante.
Actually, Michael was a long
Oh,
time ago.
Michael, Renee, Shante.
I just wanted to say that you said something about the younger son and the poor. I had never. That's the first time I have ever heard that kind of interpretation. That we kind of, what about that? And I suspect that I'm going to spend the next week going through all of the commentaries on and look, because I think that's a really, it's a hard thing for liberals like me to even consider. But the question is, and I've always had this question: is when are we enablers and when are we blesser? When are we doing blessings and when are we being enablers? And what you just said has just tweaked something in me that I've got to think about and worry about for a while.
Okay, then good. The thing I always love about that story is, well, I don't love it. It kind of irks me a little. Is the ending, because you don't know whether the older son goes into the party or not. And I always want to, sort of get into the story, take him by the hand, and walk him into the celebration. Can he go?
Write an ending.
Well, yeah. I mean, lots of people have. I mean, it's been done. This isn't an original thought at all. It's been done before. But I mean, that poor guy, you know, to not be able to celebrate a homecoming, to be that insecure about his father's love for him, you know. Everything I have has always been yours. You've always had everything. It's a wonderful story. I mean, the reality is that's why it's great art, right? Is because 2,000 years later, it still has life and meaning and can still disturb, and evoke different things in you. I think Renee, you're next, and then Shante. Have I got that right, Andrew?
Yes.
I just always feel sorry for the fatted calf. It must go, oh crap, here comes the prodigal son again. And I don't eat beef, and I just, that was just an aside. And I just want to make a quick comment on your sermon, is that it was so powerful to me that it totally put me in a mode of letting go. because it was so much that I just let go. And then I felt something in myself that just gave me more strength to, okay, I'm just going to do the best that I can do today, and whatever I'm doing. So I thank you for that.
Well, I'd like to take credit for that sermon, but it really wasn't my sermon. It was the sermon of this group. Like, seriously, that it was I came in last Tuesday just overwhelmed with the magnitude of suffering and not knowing, you know, how to respond to that. And it was hearing your stories of what you were doing. And even afterwards, a few people who weren't able to be with us last Tuesday who watched the video, they actually sent in their stories of what they're doing in their places. And the reality is there are so many more people embodying being the incarnation of love in the world than there are warriors who are doing what they're doing. And one of the curses of our media is that the way the media is set up, we our natural instinct to listen into the bad news before hearing the good news, before fully appreciating, you know, that love far outweighs this present incarnation of tribalism. It's difficult to find balance. And I think that therein lies the value of community, you know, because it is overwhelming to watch this stuff. And I worry about people who live alone and watch this over and over and over again, and are constantly exposed to it. I've taken to forcing myself to watch Fox News, because the reality is Fox News has more viewers than all your other news stations put together. There are more people watching Fox. That's true week after week after week. And so how do we understand people who are different than us? Well, we have to sort of begin with what it is that they're caught up in, what it is they're watching. And it's not easy. Like, trust me, I have to be in a particular frame of mind before I can watch it, and I do it in very small doses, because it is just like mainstream media and even radical media sources. It's all a kind of propaganda. I mean, even sermons are propaganda. If you think about it, we're trying to influence people to behave in particular ways, and so to understand why people are so afraid and so unwilling to be generous of others with others, I think you have to know what it is that's shaping them. And right now, even in Canada, I mean, we saw that with this truck convoy. We saw the influence of right-wing media and right-wing religion, and what it can do, and how fragile our you know, comfortable lifestyles are in terms of that kind of anger and fear. And so how are they being shaped and molded? And is there a way that we can speak with them, or at least hear their fear and respond to it? I find it difficult to respond to it in a loving way. I'm from Belfast. I just want to argue them to death, you know, try and change their minds. And that doesn't work. It just doesn't. And so how do we change them in a loving way? And that's really difficult to, and for me, my place to start is to try and figure out why their fears are so amplified, and why they seem incapable of responding with any kind of generosity. And so whether that will just have me sinking into, debating with them or not, I don't know. But right now, that's the place where I have to start. That was a tangent. Who's next, Andrew?
I guess.
Steve's got his hand up. Go for it.
Just want to piggyback on that. I think I mean, it comes back to a story narrative. We have got to change our story, and story influences people. So that's just something, I mean, that's just a marker for the church to, okay, how can we influence this by changing our story, changing the narrative? Yeah.
And I think one of the, I'm with you there, because I think that the myth of redemptive violence is the story that the church has given to the world for centuries, particularly since the 4th century. We have given this myth of redemptive violence to the world, and the world has run with it. Just read the comments from the patriarch in Moscow. I mean, just read a little bit about Samaritan's Purse and where they're at with this, because they made a bargain with the patriarch. And they're in a really uncomfortable place right now. I don't think that, what's his name? The Graham son. I've refused to learn his name. Sorry. That's not very generous. It's the same as his father, isn't it, Billy? Billy Jr.? No, I don't know what. Anyway, the guy who runs Samaritan Purse right now.
Yeah.
What's it? Sorry? I missed that.
Somebody say it? No.
Anyway, he's Graham something or other. I think it's Billy. He made a bargain with the Orthodox Church in Russia, because he wanted access. He wanted access to people in Russia, and it was basically to feed that particular version of the powers that you're talking about, Steve. And that bargain isn't working well for him right now. And so he has some choices to make. He either doubles down on it, or he walks back. And I don't think he has it within him to walk back. So, and I've been getting a lot of trolls on our sites, people who are talking about the reality that Jesus is coming any day now. And this particular whore of Babylon, I better beware. So that stuff is that story is permeating through the culture. And I know we think it's just a few nutcases, but these people have millions of viewers. Like millions. And I know that maybe even if half of them are people who are just going on to view to see how crazy people can get, or trying to figure out what the other side is doing. But even if half of them are like that, it's still in the millions, right? So it's a concern. How do we find creative ways to respond to people's fear with kindness and with love that might have some ability to move them from their less than generous way of being in the world? Shantae, you're trying to get in here.
Yes, it's Franklin Graham.
Franklin, that's right. Thank you.
And I have to tell you, I worked with that group in Cambodia. We did a water purification program that he brought, which was a very economical, and I did work with them. We partnered to do that water project. So yeah, no, I have to tell you, as we're speaking, I've got 100 things going on in my mind. I am in the midst of a community that watches Fox News all the time, everywhere I go. So I've tried to watch, but I have a hard time listening to the Fox. I have to admit it, but I feel like I can think for myself. So, and the other part of the news is, in Canada, you have the Samaritan's Purse, but you also have the Canadian Food Grains Bank, okay? They're one of our biggest allies, and they with ACT Alliance, and they're going to lot of work going to go on in Ukraine. So you have good news there. I just wanted to tell you.
Yeah, and just let me harp in there. ACT Alliance is they're the people who are on the ground, and we funnel things through Canadian Lutheran World Relief,
Yes.
and even Lutheran World Relief in the States. They all work only with people who are actually on the ground. They don't come in and do.
Yeah.
They try to work on the ground. Sorry to interrupt, but yeah,
Yeah, but
ACT is one of our big
yeah.
partners.
We worked with Lutheran World Relief in India, and I'll have to tell you that that's the good news of all the stuff we talked about and what's happening. And we had a meeting this week, so there's a lot of good work going on. We need to pray for that. On the prodigal son, I read the book by Henry Nouwen.
Mm-hmm.
And that's an amazing book to read, and we did a Bible study on that. I attended a course led by Landmark. It's about learning to discover more about yourself, self-help kind of growth, understanding. And one of the biggest thing that they always emphasize is, if you have two people in a discussion or a couple having problem, whatever, it's how we tell the story. It could be the same. The parable is very much like that. We hear something and then we all come up with what we hear. And it's so amazing if we just stop, like we all think of how to tell the story. If I listen to everybody, it would be a different version of how they understand that story. And they're not telling you a lie, they're telling you the truth, but that's how they see it. So that's what I see in all the parables, especially the prodigal son, is how do we see which character do you fit into as you see, and what are the things that we can take home with it. So I just, all these things are going on in my mind. And then you went into the Fox News and I'm like very troubled.
I know, it's really hard. I don't recommend it as a steady diet, but certainly you need to dip in to know what's going on. So I want to follow up on your talk about story, in that we all tell the story differently, and based on what we see here in the story. And so my point with Jesus, seeing Jesus, the story of Jesus as a parable, is to stop seeing Jesus as the object of worship and begin to see Jesus as a character in a story of resistance. Because then I believe the possibility exists for incarnation of Jesus here and now. This is how I understand resurrection, is the way in which Jesus is able to be alive here and now. Because if we enter the story, and Holy Week is great for this because it begins with Palm Sunday. You go to the Maundy Thursday piece, where he's intimate with his community. You have the horrors of Good Friday, where he refuses to engage in violence, and then you have the reality that even the worst thing that power and principality, that empire can throw at Jesus, which is death, can't kill his vision of justice, can't kill what he's doing. So if you can see yourself as a participant in that parable, what role are you playing and when are you playing it? Then that parable has the ability to speak to us here and now. And then there's real potential for the incarnation to actually happen. You know, resurrection looks like us being refreshed for resistance. Resurrection is us standing toe to toe with the oppressed. Resurrection is us mobilizing to be love in the world, and sometimes it's love far away where people need our help, but oftentimes it's on our own doorstep. And so for me, just taking all the worship aspect out of Holy Week, stop worshiping Jesus, and begin to see Jesus as the penultimate parable of resistance, which if you get an opportunity, I should grab that book at some point. I'll put it in the link. I'll put a link to when I put the video up to that book. It, what they're talking about is the reality that the church, that as we know it today, is not what these communities were like in the first couple of centuries of the Common Era. These communities gathered around these stories because stories are how humans bring one another together. They gathered around these stories so that they could function within the oppression of empire, so that they could function in poverty, because there's a reason why they gathered around meals. There was food insecurity all around them, and it was only in coming together that they could experience any kind of peace from the hungers that they were dealing with. And so what these communities did is they gathered around these stories of resistance, these parables of resistance, and supported one another in their resistance to empire in small or large ways. And so when you begin to see it like that, it's like, okay, so what is the purpose of us gathering together in community? It's to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, resist the systems of oppression that create hungry and naked people, that perpetrate violence, and to empower people in that resistance, and to usher in a new kind of empire. I think one of the things that's difficult is the word basileia. It means, which is what we translate as kingdom. It has such a broader meaning. And what we're really talking about is replacing the empires of domination that we're enmeshed in with a different way of being in the world. And that we often call it gets translated in English translations as kingdom of God. Some people I often use the phrase kingdom. Usually people think spell check just hasn't done its duty. So the best way to use that word, I think, is just to leave it in Greek with basileia, which if you translate it literally, it means, it's the plural feminine for majesty. So kingdom's a really bad translation. And if you look at that word, it's saying Caesar is not our God. We're going to follow this freedom fighter who fought in a completely different way. And so that parable of resistance, if you take Holy Week and make it about our own personal piety, which I've been guilty of in the past, make it about our own personal piety, it becomes a salve for our participation in empire. If you use it as a parable of resistance, then it makes Good Friday even more horrendous than when you're worshiping Jesus, I think. But it also makes resurrection possible. Anyway, another tangent. Sorry about that. Anyone else have anything to offer with regard to where we're at in the church year? We've got two parables. One is the parable of the family. Let's call it that. I don't know what it is. It's definitely not just the parable of the prodigal son, but it's the parable of the family. And then the following week, if I'm correct, is the story of the anointing, Mary's anointing of Jesus. Is it? I can't remember. I usually save that until Maundy, Thursday, but I think in our lectionary it comes up on the fifth Sunday as well.
That's different than ours, because ours is the woman caught in adultery, which really gets me fired up, so.
The woman caught in adultery. Okay, there's another parable for you. I'm just looking at what ours is on the fifth Sunday. We use the Revised Common Lectionary, which I think it's the anointing. Yeah, it's the anointing.
Mm.
Yeah. But either way, they're parables of resistance. And we can really use them in that way. But for so many people, the Holy Week experience becomes something about our own piety. And I know it was for me for many years. And so trying to push a little bit and say, it's not about you. It's not about you worshiping Jesus. It's not about you. It's about it is in many ways, and it's one of the reasons why I won't give up the symbol of the cross. People say, "Oh, you're focusing on the death of Jesus." No, I'm not. I'm not focusing on the death of Jesus. I'm focusing on the death of everything we crucify here and now, over and over again. I don't like a single cross so much. I think the symbol needs to be so many crosses we can't differentiate between them because there's so many of them. Because if you try to figure out where all the crucifixion sites are today, there are millions of them. We're all over the world, and the earth is probably the biggest cross. Steve, I see your hand up there.
Yeah,
again.
yeah. Quickly on the cross thing, I stuck my toe into Rene Girard's philosophies on scapegoating, and basically his thought is, you know, Jesus was the ultimate scapegoat, and we should stop scapegoating. If we've scapegoated the Son of God, I mean, okay, that means scapegoating's got to be stopped. But we didn't look at it that way. So that's just
Well,
another
and
way.
so many of our stories, our sacred stories, are designed to stop us from scapegoating. I mean, even the story of Abraham, when he takes Isaac up there, you'd have thought that would have gotten people over the scapegoating. No, that doesn't work. And so we have story after story after story where there needs to be a sacrifice. And the whole myth of redemptive violence, it seems to me that argument between the myth of redemptive violence and love and justice, and peace through justice, that argument between those two sides is rife all the way through scriptures. And it's not just in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, but it's also it's present in the Gitas, and it's present in the Quran. You know, this struggle within humanity around issues of violence, and unless we can honestly struggle with that in ourselves, I don't think we solve the problem. All right, how we doing? You got more of a preview of Holy Week than you got, but the next couple of Sundays will be previewing Holy Week anyway, because we're in Lent, and that's what we do in Lent, is we preview that. Michael, is that your hand up there, or? No, okay, Shantae's hand is up.
Dawn, could you please, you said the parable of resistance. So I'd like to hear a little bit more. I'm thinking about that, and I'm not too clear. So I'm looking.
So in terms of the story that we are invited into by the church during Holy Week is the story of Jesus' journey to Jerusalem and what happens to him in Jerusalem. And we have framed that story, the church has framed that story in a way that talks about the myth of redemptive violence, which sees Jesus as obediently going to Jerusalem in order to sacrifice himself, or to be sacrificed, depending on which denomination you're reading it from, to be sacrificed as because of the sins of humanity, right? So that's the way the story is often presented, and people are invited into the story to journey with Jesus, to walk with Jesus to the cross, and it becomes about Jesus died for me. my sins, becomes about this is why I love Jesus, because Jesus loved me so much. And that's that from the perspective of the ancients, even the church fathers, is considered a childlike understanding of the story of Jesus. And it's designed to reach people at a particular place in their development, right? The problem is the church stuck with that as the story, the only way to interpret that story. And what I'm suggesting is that in the first 4 centuries, these stories were shared amongst the resistors to empire, the communities that gathered together who were actively resisting Rome. And they were a movement, both Jewish, Christian, and there are a number of other faiths there, and people of no faith as well, who were parts of these communities. And more archaeologists are digging stuff up and providing us with insights into life in first century Palestine and later on, right up through Constantine. And so what we're discovering is that there was this loose political affiliation where people told these stories to encourage one another in the resistance of Rome. And if you look at the story of Jesus as that kind of story, whether you call it a parable or not, a parable just means a story that has the power to upend the way you think about things. It's basically something that can create metanoia, right? But if you look at those parables, if you look at the stories that we tell during Holy Week as individual parables, that's one way to do it. Dom Crossan does an excellent job. Every year I read The Last Week by Dom Crossan and Marcus Borg. Read that. He's got a new book coming out in next week. I think Tuesday, the 29th of March, he's got a new book coming out. If you haven't read Dom Crossan before, start with The Last Week. He writes that with Marcus Borg, and Marcus makes Dom more
Accessible.
That's the word I'm looking for. Dom's earliest books were academic books designed for New Testament scholars, and they're brilliant, but they're not as accessible as he is when he writes with Marcus. So anything you see Dom Crossan and Marcus Borg's name on, it's designed for the lay reader. And I think that this next book is kind of combination of the two. So there'll be some technical stuff here, but it will also be accessible. I've only read one chapter. I got a proof chapter that I was able to read because I'm on a mailing list with Dom Crossan. And it seemed pretty accessible to me. So I think I'm looking forward to it. Anyway, where was I going with that? So if you look at the stories that we tell in Holy Week as individual parables, that's one way to see them and to read them through the lens of resistance, which is not the lens that we usually read these stories through. We read these stories through the lens of the myth of redemptive violence. Okay? And so if we read them through the lenses of resistance, and I'm suggesting if we take the entire story of Holy Week, beginning with Palm Sunday and ending with resurrection, if you take that entire story as a single parable of resistance, we will begin to have an understanding of who Jesus might have been to those resistors of the Roman Empire. And that then empowers us to incarnate, so to embody that resistance here and now in this place to the various different empires in which we are enmeshed. I mean, most people in first century Palestine were enmeshed in 2 empires. One was Rome, and the other one was the temple, and however you interpret that. And so they had 2 empires to contend with. There were probably some other empires locally that they also had to contend with. I can't even begin to count the number of empires that we are enmeshed in, right? So how do we embody that here and now? And I think if we read the life of Jesus, the entire life of Jesus, as a parable, Jesus himself is a parable of resistance. But he's not the ultimate parable of resistance, because if you say he's the ultimate parable of resistance, you run the danger of just simply worshiping him again. He's the penultimate, which means, before the last, the one before the last. He's the penultimate parable of resistance, because the ultimate parable of resistance is us and how we resist here and now. And I think unless we change the way in which we tell the story of Jesus, he's just a superhero who existed in the first century, and he has very little to say to us here and now. And we should stop, because we're just encouraging people to worship something that really isn't going to help them much in the world today. I think if we're serious about resurrection, we have to be serious about it in our bodies and what we do with our lives. That's what resurrection is. So now I don't have to preach the sermons in Holy Week, okay? You've got it all. I don't know what I'm going to say in Holy Week now, but that's where I'm going with this. And it's where I've always been going since I started this whole progressive quest. It's trying to help people see the parables in different ways, see the stories in different ways, ways that drag them into the parable, so that then together we can become the incarnation of resistance. The language of resistance hasn't always been there in me. That's new in the past 4 or 5 years. But I think unless we're prepared to resist, for me, I use the word violence, because that before I use the word empire, but I think it's this whole myth of redemptive violence, that all we need is a scapegoat, and we can make everything better again. I mean, just look at what we're doing with this current situation. I'm afraid that the current narrative is setting up Russia as the scapegoat. And we are going to be led like sheep to a place where we can see Russia as the enemy again, because we need another scapegoat. I'm afraid that may be what we're doing, is we're just feeding ourselves back into this myth that if we can just find someone to blame. We did it. Canada didn't jump on board, granted, but when the United States went into Iraq, they set Iraq up as the scapegoat, and took a good portion of the world into that violence, and it was that whole myth of that, we can stop terrorism this way, and it didn't really stop terrorism. We've just moved on to whole new kinds of terrorism. How do we stop violence? And I know that pacifism is not easy in times like these, but pacifism is not passive. It's active resistance, and that's different than violence. And it can get you killed, because it got Jesus killed, right? You can die from it. It's very dangerous to embody that. All right, I'm looking at the time. Anyone have anything they want to?
Hand up.
Judy, is
Yeah.
that whose hand I'm seeing? Go for it, Judy.
Yes. As hard as it is to watch the news, I see a theme of resistance emerging. The Russian soldiers who went to the border thought they were going for military exercises. And some of them are leaving, they're defecting. And the Russian people aren't for this war. and other countries around also. And so kind of a natural thing is happening, is what I see, and it gives me hope. I didn't
Yeah.
get it from Fox News,
Yeah.
MSNBC, or just the network news, but especially yesterday, last night, it just seemed like something is happening.
Yeah.
And
I think we're underestimating the response. I think we're not celebrating what's happening in places like Poland and Moldova. What's the new name of Moldova? It's Moldova.
Moldova.
Moldova. I have to learn not to use the Russian, anglicized Russian versions of everything. Moldova, Hungary, countries that aren't very wealthy are accepting millions of refugees flooding across their borders. So we're up to around 3.5 million right now. So let's just take this as a story, right? And see how it would play if tomorrow, supposing tomorrow, 4 million Canadians went rushing into the United States. What would be the response? Supposing tomorrow, 4 million Mexicans or South Americans came flooding into the United States. Okay, now all you smug Canadians, suppose tomorrow 4 million Fox News watchers flooded into Canada. See, Doug is losing it. I love Doug's facial expressions. I mean, that's the challenge that these folks are now. They have done a remarkable job of opening up their homes and bringing people in. We in Canada have been slow to mobilize and to get Ukrainians here. We're slowly trying to do that. But what are we going to do about Syrians? What are we going to do about the refugees who are economic refugees? Are we prepared to open? See, this is the power of story, right? We can all applaud the Polish people. This is wonderful. I'm so glad the Poles have done this. You know, Poland is a small, not very wealthy country, wealthy by world standards, but not by European standards. And they have received the bulk of refugees. I think it's in excess of just under 2 million people have gone into Poland. Now, some of them are moving on to other places, but Poland has a population similar to Canada. Could we receive 2 million people? You know, what would be the responses? The Polish people have been wonderfully generous right now. Are they going to be so generous another month from now?
Lily?
When they're bursting at the seams, are they going to be tested? And how are we going to respond to that? Are we going to help them out? Like, how do we deal with this challenge? Like, if we take that story and just say, all hail the Poles, they're wonderful, they're great, and not ask ourselves, like, it becomes a parable when it disturbs us, when we try to figure out, could we receive 4 million Fox News watchers here? It's a big country. I could probably get away from them. But Poland is not such a big country. You know, just imagine how this is changing. Renee, jump in.
Imagine 2 million Russian refugees. How would you
Yeah.
accept them?
Exactly. Finland has accepted huge amounts right now. Finland is an interesting position because the Russians can get there relatively easily. They have lots of transportation links to Finland. And I think the last number I saw was about 400,000 Russians have fled to Finland. Now, they're not planning to stay in Finland. They're going to be lots of exodus, and they're mostly young people. and they're calling it the biggest brain drain from Russia since the revolution, because young Russians are just getting out. So it's the largest mass migration in Europe since the Second World War. And people had a different attitude toward refugees then, because they had an affinity. And I think that was racial. I really do. I mean, just look at what has happened in the UK in the last few hundred years, in terms of their willingness to grant citizenship to folks. When was the last time they would grant citizenship to people of the old British Empire? I think it was in the 60s. But then
Lily's hand.
Lily, go for it, darling.
Amazon is helping people in Poland. Like, there's a restaurant near the border of Ukraine and Poland, and Amazon is giving millions of dollars to that restaurant to feed 500 people a day.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I think that's a complicated question, because I think corporations are just latching on to the idea that the public is supportive of these kinds of moves. I mean, the closing of McDonald's, or I mean, I know there's a boycott of Burger King now because Burger King hasn't closed. They have a different franchise thing, but it's going to become incumbent on corporations to at least posture a kind of good citizenship, whether or not you might ask the question about the kind of citizenship that Amazon offers. And I say that with a couple of items around me that came from Amazon, more than just a few. So I'm enmeshed in the Amazon system of empire myself. Are they posturing? Are they serious? I don't know.
And there is some benefit.
Yeah. And so what goodness comes out? I mean, Samaritan's Purse. I mean, I vehemently object to their policy of trying to convert people to their religion, but some good does come out of what they do. So it's a mixed bag. There's Dom Crossan talks about the power of the fierce urgency of now, and how that changes our perception of things. And there seems to be a kind of fierce urgency right now to address some of these issues. And I think that if we are empowered in our resistance, if we are supported, nourished, grounded, and sustained in our resistance, we will respond to that fierce urgency of now in more positive ways. And there'll be some potential for more goodness to come out of it. But that's just my feeling on it. I remain a hopeless optimist. I know that it doesn't always sound that way, but I'm also a pragmatist, and that's a hard thing to juggle in one person. I see that we've gone over time. Some people have sent some farewells through the chat, and so I thank you for this. Next week, let's get into this a little bit more, and I think we'll have some opening time where you can reflect on what happens in the sermon. You can see what I do with the parable of the family, but let's talk a little bit more about viewing Jesus not as the object of worship, or not as the second person of the Trinity or any of those theological things, but trying to view Jesus as a character in this parable of resistance, and how that changes who Jesus is, and what we think about in terms of crucifixion and resurrection, and more importantly, about resistance. There's your homework. I'm not supposed to give you homework, but you've certainly given me lots of homework, so that's good. It's all good.
Lots to think about. Lots to think about.
Yeah. Anyway, peace be with you, dear ones. Thank you for this time together. I do enjoy being with you so much. Peace, darlings.